This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This episode is brought to you by GEA. Around the world, every second liter of beer is brewed with the aid of systems and processes from GEA because their solutions address even the smallest details of the brewing process. GEA's range of services include everything from engineering, manufacturing, delivery, installation, automation, servicing, and more. At GEA, their goal is to help brewers make more beer of the highest quality in a cost-efficient and sustainable manner. To learn more, visit GEA.com and be sure to follow the GEA Craft Brewing page on Facebook. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Bogner, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. My guest on the podcast today is Sean Lawson of Lawson's Finest Liquids in Warren, Vermont. Welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, Jamie. I really appreciate your interest in me and our brewery.
Well, we've been trying to get a conversation together for the magazine and other reasons for, it seems like a good 18 months now, but we've been patient and it's fantastic to finally talk to you. And I'm glad that we can do it in the context of the podcast.
It's good to be here. Well, that lines up pretty well with the busiest 18 months of my entire life, working on our new production brewery and tap room and retail store up in Waitsfield, Vermont.
Big things are afoot for you, but you got started on what is quite possibly the smallest of commercial scales as a minuscule, consumer business. Brewing in small batches, from your home. Tell me a little bit about where that brewing interest, how that budded, and how you made the decision to kind of move from hobby into profession in this.
It's a long arc. It started back in 1990 when I was a student at the University of Vermont up in Burlington, Vermont. And my buddy Matt Robinson came over one day and he brought a couple of his home brews and cracked them open and he poured them in a glass and I took a sip. I was like, wow, Matt, it's one of the best beers I've ever had. This is better than what you can buy in the store. Can you show me how? And he's like, of course, let's make up some homebrew. And, a week later, he came over and we were cooking up a batch of homebrew in my kitchen at the end of Lafayette Place in downtown Burlington, my apartment there. And that really started my love of homebrewing and brewing in general is where it all started. And so right after college, I went out to ski bum out in Colorado. And I went all over town looking for a job. Couldn't get one because it wasn't ski season yet. So we went to the Breckenridge Pub and Brewery at the end of the day and pulled up a bar stool with my buddy who was equally unsuccessful finding a job that day. And we ordered some beers. I asked the bartender, you guys aren't hiring by any chance? He says, yeah, I think we are. Let me get the kitchen manager. He comes out and he's like, well, we have a job as a dishwasher. I was like, I'll take it. Hired me on the spot. And so that was the first brewery I worked in back in 1992 was the Breckenridge Pub and Brewery when it was just a little brew pub up in Breckenridge. Yeah. And I was ski bumming after college. And so it gave me the first window into the professional brewing world. And I eventually working in the kitchen, worked my way up the line to, line cook and then sous chef during my short tenure there of less than a year. But at the same time, I kept poking into the brewery and asking questions, and they eventually let me help out with hand filling bottles for their sales over the counter, like the packaged bombers to go and washing kegs. And so that was my first brewery experience. And then the next year, I moved down to Flagstaff, Arizona for a job, and I got a job there in the kitchen at the Beaver Street Pub and Brewery before it even opened. So I got to see the whole thing come together, the equipment go in. That was really fascinating to me. But I had a degree in environmental studies, and I was pursuing a career in sort of conservation science. So I did that. I ended up going back to school for forestry. And for 15 years, I was really avid home brewer. And I just loved brewing. I would brew all the time. And I loved beer. I loved good beer. Discovered good beer there in Burlington with my buddy Matt's homebrew, and the Vermont Pub and Brewery was located in downtown. They opened up in 1988, the same year I started at UVM. There was Catamount Brewing, and Long Trail started those early years. Loved those beers. And so after about 15 years of my homebrewing steadily improving, people kept saying, wow, do you sell any of this? Can I buy it? And I'm just like, yeah, well, here's 2 bottles. No, I don't, you can't buy it, but I can give you a few bottles.
Sure.
And so people kept saying, this is better than what I could get in the store. And when I was a kid coming out of college, I didn't really see brewing or being in the beer industry as a calling that was kind of worthy. I was out there to save the world with an environmental studies degree.
Yeah.
I went back for my master's in forestry, and that science background has really served me well in the brewery. But to get to the point of sort of a long story, it was the encouragement from friends and family that I eventually decided, and just maturing enough to see brewing as both an act of creation and a really worthy calling, most especially because at the end of the day, the beer that we make, it creates happiness for people. And that's what I really love most about brewing beer, is that people love the liquids, and it creates happy and memorable experiences most of the time.
Hopefully you can remember them, sure.
And so then I started out with the 1-barrel system. I had a career in forestry and science and research at that point, and so I'm not quitting my day job.
Yeah.
I got a 1-barrel system. I didn't even know the term nano brewery existed.
Right.
And someone said, "Oh, you're a nano brewer." I'm like, "Oh, what? A nano brewer? Yeah, really small, smaller than micro brewer." And so I was like, oh, okay. And that was in 2008. And I started cranking out 1-barrel batches and bringing them in my car. I got all licensed, of course. I built a little, what amounts to a glorified shed, which I call the most expensive shed in Vermont. And I started brewing the beer there, would do the deliveries myself, and because I had a following already with my homebrew and it was such small scale, it would sell as fast as I could make it. And I was brewing on nights and on weekends. I did that for a year, and I also wanted to test it out. See, is this something I really want to do?
Sure.
Full time? Do I really want to spend my life doing this? Because I had done that with ski patrolling up at Mad River Glen, because I love skiing. And after I moved back from being out west for a few years to Vermont and to pursue my master's, I got a job as a ski patroller up at Mad River Glen, and I did that full time. And for me, it took a little bit of the fun out of skiing, because it was a recreational pursuit for me. I really enjoyed my time on the ski patrol. Great skills I picked up there. Most importantly, great people that I got a chance to work with that are still my close friends. Mad River Glen is like part of my extended family these days. And I digress, but I still work there part-time. I lead naturalist tours and snowshoeing on the weekends during the winter up there. So it's been important for me as our business has grown not to give that up. But to keep giving you the long story of the trajectory of Lawson's Finest, so I quit my job after a year, and I went to work in my own little brewery full-time and started cranking up the 1-barrel system. So I went from like 50 barrels the first year to a little over 100 barrels the second year, and not much more than over 100 barrels the third year, because that was about as much as I could do, and I only had 4 little fermenters. And it was overdue. The original vision was, if it worked, to put in a 7-barrel system. But instead of taking a year, it took me about 3 years, which is often how things go. So in 2011 was when I brought in the 7-barrel system and got that fitted up. And of course, it was immediately too small. And so I started grinding on the 7-barrel system and making as much beer as I could in our little 200 square foot brewery next to my house in Warren, Vermont, with a cooler attached to it, and still self distributing, and more people kept asking for our beer. So what do I do next? I'm like, I'm not ready with really young kids to build a new brewery. I don't have the capital. I'm not ready to hire a whole bunch of people. I'm not ready for that lifestyle change. So that's when we started working with Two Roads Brewing down in Stratford, Connecticut. And I had read about their plans and their opening and their focus on quality and bringing in all this brand new equipment. And I said that might be a place that I could make the beer with the quality and the flavor profile that matches what we do in Warren, Vermont. And I would be able to hopefully not say no all the time, which I was doing. No, we don't have enough beer. No, we don't distribute to other states. No, I can't sell you my beer. No, we're not adding any more distribution here in Vermont. And it enabled us to be able to say yes a lot more often. Yeah. And that's where we started brewing the Sip of Sunshine and our Super Session beers in 2014. And so the last 4 years have been great. We've experienced tremendous growth with those beers,
but it clicked.
Yeah,
and
really
you found
clicked.
that you didn't hate this.
No, yep. Well, I love it. I mean, I found once I got
and it didn't destroy your passion for brewing.
Not at all. If anything, it made me more passionate about brewing and more interested in learning all that I could about brewing. Never having been to formal brewing school or any brewing education that's formal, and never having worked in someone else's brewery as a full-time employee, learning my way around a brewing system. So it was all self-taught.
Tell me a little bit about that, because then taking your recipes from a 1-barrel to a 7-barrel system, and then taking them from a 7-barrel system to, I think, what is Two Roads at 100-barrel?
100-barrel Rolec, yeah.
Right. That had to be a very interesting move to take those things and translate them in the way that you wanted to. And I know that, from your perspective, doing it right is one of the premier driving forces behind what you do.
It's paramount. It's all about the liquids and the quality of what's inside. What really helped me was working with other brewers, doing collaborations in the years that I was brewing on the 7-barrel system. So I worked with Paul Saylor and Destiny up at Zero Gravity Brewing to do one of my first collaborations with them on their 10-barrel system, because I didn't have enough beer to attend the Vermont Brewers Festival. It required 3.5 barrels, or 7 half barrels, or a whole bunch of logs. So you need the volume of 3.5 barrels just to attend the festival, because it's a multi-session festival with great attendance down on the waterfront in Burlington, Vermont. And so they helped me out tremendously by saying, well, why don't we do a collaboration and you can take that beer to the festival. And so we scaled up one of my recipes, the Knockout Blonde, onto their 10-barrel system. So that was my first lesson in scaling up. And then scaling up my 1-barrel recipes to the 7-barrel system was another lesson in scaling up. And then I worked with Mike Gerhardt at Otter Creek for a couple of years, making our double dose annual double IPA collaboration, working on their 40-barrel system. So taking recipes from smaller systems, or even just developing recipes like we did with the double dose on their larger system, gave me some experience in doing that. So when I got to Two Roads in 2014, I basically wrote the recipe myself based on their extraction rate for the malt, and most importantly, in doing that, in working with Two Roads, I said to them up front, this is great, we've got this all worked out, but everything is predicated on the quality of the beer coming out the way that our fans and Lawson's Finest would expect it to.
Right.
So I'm not moving forward unless the beer comes out right. We'll do a couple of batches, and what was fantastic was they were fine with that. They're like, that's our commitment to you too. If we can't make the beer that you want, then there's no point in moving forward with a relationship like that.
That's really interesting, because I mean, typically in a contract relationship like that, before they start brewing and put that work into getting you into it, they'd want a long-term commitment and more barrels, and at least a few hundred to 1,000 barrels a year to even get started. And I like that idea that they said it depends on whether it actually comes out the way you want it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's fortunate for both of us that when they started out, there's a real demand for capacity out there before the latest building boom. That a lot of small brewers are looking for capacity as a way to meet the demand that they can't meet. So they certainly had more demand for their capacity than they had capacity at the outset.
Right.
And they've been very successful in growing their brewery, both their own brand and their contract and alternating proprietorship breweries. So I'm actually the licensed brewer when our beers are made there. Right. We have a brewery license, both Connecticut and federally, for the operations down at Two Roads. So it's Lawson's Finest Liquids technically is making the beer down at Two Roads under that agreement.
But the flip side of that too is that having Lawson's as a premier customer certainly had to be a mark of prestige for Two Roads and their contract business.
I think it's been good for both of us.
For sure. From a customer perspective, going from a hard to find beer that consumers have to seek out and go to very specific retail places in a very small footprint, going from there to brewing 100-barrel batches and canning them and pushing them out into retail channels has to be a bit of a shift, culturally for your brewery and for your staff. How have consumers responded to that, and how has your business changed from that?
Our business has changed amazingly over the years, from being at farmers markets in the early years selling our hand-bottled beers to, producing a lot of cases of beer that go out now to 6 states in different markets. And the only reason that I shouldn't say the only reason, but one of the biggest reasons that we've been successful was that there was that pull there from customers before we distributed in any of those other places, that a lot of people were asking for our beer, looking for our beer, driving to Vermont to get our beer.
Sure.
And so having that built-in demand certainly has made it easier for us, but that's all predicated on having the beer that people want to drink, and that it's consistently good and that the quality is there and it delivers what people are expecting.
That is an interesting question. Obviously you make beer that's in high demand, but to some degree we're watching beer change really fast.
Yeah.
What consumers are seeking out, what they like to drink, and there are significant shifts even within pretty standard styles. How do you keep up with that, and how do you balance that core idea of what your beer is and what that brand of Lawson's Finest is versus that consumer interest in something new and where their palates are going?
I don't really know the answer to that question. We just keep doing what we're doing, and thankfully people love it. We haven't jumped on the hazy train, although our beer back in the day they called it hazy, but I think the beers they call hazy IPAs these days, our beer I'm not so sure that qualifies for that. It's a little too clear. It's got some haze in there.
It is funny how that definition shifts.
Yeah. So
you don't consider your beer New England style IPA then?
Not really the way it's defined, and I think the examples that get held up as New England IPAs are completely opaque. You can't see through them, and if you hold up a glass of Sip of Sunshine, it's got a little bit of haze in there, but generally you can see through that beer. It's got it just has a little bit of that residual hop oil, a little bit of yeast carryover. It's not filtered, but it does go through a centrifuge, so it does clarify the beer some, but we try to leave just the right amount of haze in there so that it presents nicely, and it has a clean flavor, and that it's fairly stable for a few months. As it gets out there. Hopefully it doesn't last for a few months unless somebody sticks it in their fridge and they wait to drink it.
For sure. You centrifuge at all?
We centrifuge, yeah. So that does separate the beer. It does provide clarity to the beer, and most importantly, consistency to the beer, so that we are producing a consistent product at the end of the day. But tough to do because it's an agricultural product.
Right,
The ingredients
right.
vary all the time, so we do our best to smooth out those changes. But people notice when the ingredients change, and some of it's beyond our control. You can't control how the growing year was for the hop crop. So
For sure.
there's some nuances that come through there.
But I also think that that's something that can be celebrated. That
Yeah.
this idea of ultimate consistency and unchanging character is it's not human. It's not real.
Yeah.
It's not doesn't reference the world that we live in, where these things do change, where weather patterns affect these crops, and it's interesting. It's not just in flavor. I've talked to brewers who are like, our Citra crop this year makes our beer hazier. We can't nothing has changed in our recipe, and we just get this effect out of it. And that's. Is that a terrible thing? I don't know.
Not
if it
at all.
is.
Yeah, it makes it harder to produce the beer with the profile exactly the way you want it. But we're forward with our customers about that. Say, hey, we're into the new crop of hops, and so you may notice it's a little bit more like this, and there's different flavors that present themselves because of the difference in either the lots or the crop year of the hop. So in a way, I don't know that we're celebrating it yet as much as we should, but explaining it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting position to take. That it actually may create a point of interest for your consumers to taste how that has shifted a little bit, and it creates something new. And plus, now they can check it in as a whole different beer on Untapped because it's this whole new crop year, right?
That's
You get an additional one.
It's the 2017 crop, Sip of
Exactly.
Sunshine.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about hops. You're really known for your hoppy beers, and you make other beers, and you make stouts, and you make Belgian style beers. But the beers that most people drink of yours, Sip of Sunshine, Super Session, the beers that you're producing and getting out of the market through that contract base. Tell me about that development process and how you settled on the hops that you use and how you've built a recipe base to kind of showcase those hops.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'm a hop head.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I love my hoppy beers, and so that's why IPAs are in our wheelhouse at Lawson's Finest. For me, developing the beers and how I come up with the recipes, it all starts and ends with sensory. So building a beer with a balanced profile, which for me is the right ratios of malt to hop bitterness, to how the whole beer comes together with just that intangible umami. What's the mouthfeel? What's the body like for the alcohol that it is? And then really the sensory. How does it smell? How does it taste? What's the impression after you've swallowed it and it lingers on your tongue for a minute? That's where I really start and finish with recipe development. And it's through being a home brewer for many years of trialing different recipes, different variations of ratios of where I add the hops, or how late in the boil, or how much goes into dry hopping. Having the luxury as a home brewer for almost 20 years before we started Lawson's Finest. My wife Karen and I should mention her because she's a valuable partner in all of this venture. So that experimentation sort of honed my I guess you would say, the skills, but it's on such a small scale, so it's hard to translate that to a bigger scale except through sensory. So what does it taste like? How does it feel? What's the overall impression of the beer? And again, also on the 7-barrel system, once I moved up from 1 barrel to 7 barrel, because the beers went away so fast, that I was always experimenting with different permutations of the same beer. It wasn't at all the same, and still isn't. The beers that I brew on my 7-barrel system are a constant source of experimentation, of evolution. I call it the Wizard's Workshop.
Oh,
yeah,
nice,
it's a lot of fun.
nice.
So, because there have been days where I've got a whole I've got a realm of ingredients right before me, and I don't even know what I'm gonna brew that day, and I just make it up as I go. I mean, that sounds crazy, but on 7 barrels, you have the luxury of doing that because it's not a lot of volume, and as long as I'm not doing anything crazy, because if I did, I'd have to dump it down the drain potentially, and those small batch beers, we've never sent one of those down the drain. They all come out. They all come out good. So
it's such an interesting thing because you are as you build combinations of hops in a beer, you're painting a bit. To use that kind of metaphor, but you're painting with colors that change through the process. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily, it's not as if you can think about or look at them and know how they're going to interact with each other. You have to take it a few steps further and think about what all of the processes are going to do to those, individual flavors, and then be able to project out. With those experiments, do you, when you're brewing those, do you, keep some variables consistent across that so that you can tease out some of the individual impacts of these changes that you're making in these beers?
Yeah, definitely. With IPAs on the small batch brewing that I've done, the malt bills they share some consistency. I like to play around with which specialty malts I use and vary a little bit how much I use, but the malt base tends to be fairly consistent, and I like using the same pale North American grown malt as the base malt. So that's very consistent. It provides that consistent sort of canvas to work with. And then, of course, the water is consistent, and we have very soft water in Warren, Vermont, and that was one of the reasons why our beers could translate to Stratford, Connecticut, because they have very soft water. We looked at the chemistry profile, and it almost matched. It was like very serendipitous what we're doing in Warren. So I was able to replicate the flavor, that sort of the flavor profile of the beers I'm brewing in Warren down at Two Roads. So the water and the malt base tend to be fairly consistent, and then play around with the varieties of the hops, the quantities of hops, and the timing and the point in the process that the hops get added. The biggest challenge is you never know how it's going to come out until it's finished.
Right.
But we do hop rubs, so you put the hops in your hands and you grind up the pellets and, smell them, and, you look at them, you even look at the lot analysis, so you can see, the full spectrum of measurements that they take on those hops, and try to take all that information in, and then you base it on experience of what's worked in the past.
Right.
So that's my approach to recipe development and experimenting with hops to work on our IPAs.
Do you use a lot of hops, or are you more of a single hop guy? I think there are different brewers that prefer either 2 combination hops, and there are some that love to pile 6 or 7 in there, so that those beers can be more consistent over the long run as some of the individual hops may change.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy towards that?
I go I approach it from both ends of the spectrum, but I would say most of the time really narrow it down to a couple of hops, like 2 or 3 hops for most of the IPAs that I brew, or even 1 hop. The beer in front of you, the Super Session number 8 is a single hop Mosaic session IPA, and our number 2 is a single hop Amarillo. So it really features it showcases that particular hop variety.
Let me open one of those right now.
Perfect.
All right, let me take a sip. Are there specific combinations of hops that you find yourself going back to, or that end up balancing each other in ways that you find enjoyable? I know, with a lot of brewers that I talk to, they have their go-to combos because they just offset each other in the perfect kind of way. What are those combinations for you?
Well, of course, the new school rage is always not always, but often Citra and Mosaic are a big, very popular combo these days. I definitely like that combo. That works for me. And then very traditionally, I love Cascade and Centennial, putting those two together, in a pale ale or a blonde ale. Really, they really complement each other nicely. They work well together.
With bigger IPAs like Double Sunshine, how do you scale that hop experience, to create the kind of balance that you're looking for in those bigger beers? Do you, are you changing varieties? Are you, simply looking at sheer amounts? Does the technique change?
The technique really doesn't change at all. It's just getting the amounts right. Because from a small batch recipe to a larger recipe, for example, with developing the Sip of Sunshine, which is inspired by our Double Sunshine beer that I make in Warren, there's a lot less hops that would go into the kettle because the kettle efficiency is so much higher, better kettle utilization of the hops on a 100-barrel tank than on a 7-barrel tank. So less hops go into the kettle, but as you scale, there tend to be somewhat similar ratios of hops on the dry hopping side. So whether it's if you're using a pound of hops on per barrel on a small batch scale, it doesn't change dramatically on a large scale because you're not applying heat to it, I guess. So I don't know if that's the right answer, but that's been my experience. So.
There's a lot of buzz, about effects of things like biotransformation of, dry hopping while, there's still some active fermentation, occurring.
For real.
Do you play in that field?
Experiment a little bit with that on the small batch system. Yeah. And where it really comes down to what I prefer as a flavor profile more than what's right or what's better. So much about beer, I think, is really about, well, what's your preference? And it comes down to the customer's preference. What's their preference? Because if it's not hitting it, then they're not going to buy your beer. Yeah. So for me, I tend to lean towards a clean profile, and I've found in experimenting and in putting in hops like while the yeast is very active and the beer is fermenting. The flavors of the hops don't come through as cleanly or as clearly, not in a visual sense, but in a sensory sense, in tasting them or smelling them when there's a ton of yeast in the beer still and you're hopping the beer. I like to let the yeast settle out before I dry hop, but I experiment with both. So I'm constantly experimenting in the 7-barrel system to see. It's about timing too. When in the process are you adding it? So I don't think there's any magic combination or right answer. It's just about building the beer so that it comes together in the end in the way that the brewer intends.
One of the challenges that brewers who do try to attempt those biotransformation effects is that it's harder to crop yeast off of those tanks.
Yeah, for sure.
Use that yeast because you're not going to repitch yeast with a whole bunch of hop matter in it. And so, but I guess amount of 7-barrel batch, that doesn't matter that much to you.
Right. Yeah, but it does make it harder on a big scale if you can't repitch that yeast from the tank. But there's definitely something to biotransformation with hops and yeast. And even when you're letting the yeast settle out, it's still happening. It's just to maybe a lesser extent or in a different way. And it depends a lot on temperature too. So are you dry hopping at 60 degrees or 50 degrees, or where's the temperature of the beer when you're dry hopping? I found that it definitely has a very noticeable impact on the finished product and on the impression that the hops lend to the beer. And I'm not sure what the right answer is on that one, but
what temperatures do you tend to dry hop at?
I tend to focus on cooling the beer off enough so that a typical American ale yeast can drop out. Not completely drop out, but it does start to clarify and drop out. So get it down into the 50s, and that's enough to knock the yeast down and get it settling down and to draw it off before I add the dry hops.
And then you leave it in that temperature range while you dry hop?
While I'm dry hopping, yeah. I found it definitely works for me, better to keep the beer from crash cooling before you dry hop.
Sure. One of the biggest issues, especially with hoppy beers, IPAs, and whatnot, are the effects of oxygen in the beer. I mean, it is enemy number one that can turn a beautifully designed beer into a stale and muddy mess. What steps have you taken in your process to make sure that hops character doesn't get destroyed by the effects of oxygen?
The most important thing for us has been, of course, good brewing side practices, but then as soon as the beer is finished, always keeping it cold. That's the best thing that you can do to fight the effects of oxidation and staling, which even in the most perfectly packaged beer with low oxygen package in your package, over time, and it's not a lot of time, that staling starts to take effect. There's chemical changes to the beer, and so keeping it cold is the best way to preserve the beer, and of course time. So we always want people to drink our beer fresh and keep it cold. And so those are the two most important elements once the beer is finished. On the production side, it's really just paying attention to all the fundamentals of brewing there's nothing new in there as far as oxidation goes. It's most critical post brewing, like as soon as you've fermented the beer, that's where oxidation becomes critical. So making sure all your equipment's in good working order, making sure all your connections are tight, and making sure you're gathering the right data to know whether you're doing a good job on preventing oxygen from reaching your beer in process before it's in a finished product.
You all have gone to great lengths to make sure that the folks that wholesale, distribute, and sell your beer are maintaining a chain of storage that's all cold, so that beer gets delivered to consumers in the freshest possible way. It has to be, from a business perspective, turning down potential sales channels because they can't store the beer in a certain way isn't a luxury some breweries can take, but you've gone forward that way and been successful with it.
It's a challenge. It's not the paradigm that distribution in the modern day was built on. Ironically, the model is that the kegs are all cold, but the package is all warm. So go figure. But why we've been able to be successful with not only convincing but having distributors follow through on keeping the beer cold and keeping the supply chain cold right to the customers and at the stores, which is also challenging because that's a whole nother tier, because the distributor can keep it cold to the store and the store could put it in the cooler, but then they pull it back out and put it on the shelf later on, or they put it on display later on. And so that's always a challenge. But again, thank goodness we had some pull in the market because that enabled us, that gave me some leverage in working with wholesalers who are, our most valuable partner right now in getting the beer to customers, because our whole business is based on distribution right now, and they've come along for the ride, and I'm really I'm proud of the fact that we're helping to change the paradigm a little bit, and we're educating people about the importance of keeping beer cold as a way of preserving brewery freshness and preserving the beer in the condition that the brewer intended it to reach the end consumer.
Well, right here on this Super Session can, it says "keep cold and enjoy fresh," written right around the top. It has to be a strange non sequitur for a consumer who would walk into one of those retailers that may not follow the rules and see it out warm on a shelf. Does it ever break your heart to see that?
A little bit, but what's really great is the customers are advocates, and so with social media and email, people report back to us all the time, like immediately. They're like, they've got the beer out warm on the shelf at the store. Go get them. And we do. We very politely call stores and help educate them about proper handling of the product and why it's important to keep the beer cold. And it's not just our beer. I really hope, and I've seen other breweries adopting that mantra and putting it on their package of both educating consumers and helping to educate the supply chain about the importance of keeping the beer cold and consuming it fresh. It's a consumable product, so most beer is really intended to be consumed fresh, and that's in its best state. Of course, not all beers. It varies a lot stylistically, and there are a lot of beers that are what I call keeping beers. They don't need to be drank fresh, and you know all about them. But most of the styles are really intended to be drank as soon as they're produced or very soon thereafter.
For sure. I love that you can pressure your own retailers into the way that they sell it just by creating those customer suggestions on your packaging. And it's fascinating because, much, much larger brewers employ and spend gobs of money, to have people do retail inspections and make sure that, their product is in code and yada, 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 and stored the correct way. And it's even more fascinating that you can just have your customers do it for you. And,
we call them the street team.
Nice.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice.
And we help educate retailers about fan expectations, because our fans really, they expect the beer to be cold when they go to the store and buy it. Yeah. And they expect it to be priced fairly too, because of the demand being out in front of the supply for a while. Some folks took advantage of that with price gouging, and so that's another area where we've done plenty of work on helping to educate folks, and individuals report back to us when they see something ridiculous, and we can at least have a conversation.
One of the big things here at the Craft Brewers Conference that we saw was a large brew system manufactured by GEA sitting out on the show floor that has a destination of Lawson's finest. You are getting ready to undergo a pretty major brewery expansion of your own and bring some of that brewing back in-house. Is your intention with this kind of, building this production brewery to bring it all back in-house? Will you continue to contract brew at Two Roads? Will there be, will both of those things go concurrently, or what does that future of Lawson's look like for you over the next year?
Great question, and I'm not sure about all the answers because I have to rub my crystal ball, but there are a few things that are very clear to us, and we will absolutely, most certainly, still be brewing our Sip of Sunshine and Super Session beers down at Two Roads, and I'd eventually like to, develop at least one or more beers that come out of there in the same can package format, because we have such demand for our beer. We can't replace what we're doing in Stratford, Connecticut with the new facility that we're building in Waitsfield, Vermont. But the new facility with our production brewery with a 40 hectoliter GEA system, our own canning line, and most importantly, what we've never had, which is being able to create the customer experience, the Lawson's Finest experience with our tap room and the retail store, and a destination for fans of Lawson's Finest to be able to come to, almost every day, to come and enjoy our beer in our space, and to be able to speak directly to them every day about the beers, and to be able to offer a much wider variety of beers all the time is so exciting for us. And so those things are very clear. So they'll run concurrently, our Waitsfield operation and our Stratford operation down in Connecticut at Two Roads. And so that'll enable us to keep supporting the New England market that we're in throughout the Northeast, where we're distributing our beer, and have beer to sell out the door at our retail store and in the tap room. So it's an exciting time for us. It's a little daunting because we're completely transforming our business in a number of ways, both business plan and from an employment perspective. So it's both exciting and daunting at the same time that, we're creating some great jobs, and they'll all be really good living wage or salary jobs with benefits for the local community. We're anticipating adding, at least 25 full-time equivalent positions for the new facility and the associated tap room and retail store. So for going from a mom and pop business to, full-fledged organization and a company, and executing that successfully is no small task.
Absolutely. What are you most excited about being able to brew more now that you're going to have a nice larger
variety.
choice.
Most variety. I mean, people keep asking, so what are you going to be offering? What kind of beers are going to be at the new brew house? And I was like, well, everything I've been brewing for the last 10 years, that's hit the mark. So, like our English, our dark mild, the Carrier Coffee dark mild, the Belgian styles like our the basil rhubarb saison is one of our spring seasonals. The Spring Fever is a 3.8% hoppy session beer that we just came out with on the 7-barrel system. And then the regulars on that small batch system are Double Sunshine, the Chinookered IPA, our Maple Nipple, our Faced and Maple Imperial Stout, because we've talked a lot about the IPAs today, but the maple beers are also really in my wheelhouse, and I began experimenting with maple early on as a home brewer. Matter of fact, to bring the story full circle, that very first batch of homebrew that Matt and I cooked up in my kitchen back in 1990 in Burlington, Vermont, was a maple wheat beer, because Catamount Brewing was making a maple beer at the time, a maple wheat beer, and the Vermont Pub and Brewery was making a maple beer in the spring, and I was really impressed with those beers. There was something about that authentic Vermont ingredient that really attracted me, and so I've made a number of different permutations of maple beers over the years. So the two sort of winners, well, the three that went to the front were the Maple Nipple Ale, which is kind of a strong amber, 8%, sort of a straightforward American ale that's built on a really big malty base. Has a lot of residual sweetness to give the impression of maple, because the maple syrup all ferments right out. There's no sweetness that the maple syrup adds to the beer. It just adds flavor, which is very hard to capture when the sugars all ferment out. The maple flavor goes away and it transforms. So the malt bill is essential to build up that maple flavor. And then, of course, our World Beer Cup winning Maple Triple, which is in the competition again this year. We've had great success with that beer, having won here 3 times before at the World Beer Cup in 2010, 12, and 16. So we'll be gunning for that beer. I'm still gunning for gold. We've got 2 silvers and a bronze. I'm still looking for the gold. It's kind of like the Olympics. It's awesome to win, and it's even more awesome when you get a gold. So there'll be those beers. The Knockout Blonde is one of our favorites, and what I'm really excited about is beers that aren't in our portfolio currently, like a really nice, crisp, clean lager that's lower alcohol. Having a tart beer, it's kind of like a Goza or a Berliner Weiss type of beer, something that's tart and doesn't take a year to make, would be great, because those to just round out the whole styles. And like I said at the beginning of our conversation before the podcast, was something like a lower alcohol nitro stout is something I'd really like to have in our portfolio, even if it's seasonal. But the best thing is we'll have our tap room, so there'll be a constantly varying rotation of beers going through the tap room and our retail store.
Well, we can't wait to visit once you're up and running.
Yeah,
Sean.
This autumn of 2018, we'll fling open the doors, and we hope a few folks will show up.
Well, we'll be up there this autumn to come see you.
Excellent.
Sean Lawson, thank you for joining me on the
Jamie.
Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. If people want to learn more about the beer that you make, where can they find Lawson's?
LawsonsFinest.com. We've got information about our beers, the locations where you can buy our beers, and we're posting videos and photos of the new construction and the new brewery, keeping people updated every month. And we put out a monthly beer news on the website there, the first of the month every month, so you can catch up with what's going on at Lawson's Finest Liquids.
We'll come check you out.
Excellent.
If you've enjoyed the podcast, thank you, Sean.
Yeah,
thank you
you
so
bet.
much. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you like to learn more about how to brew beer and those fantastic brewers like Sean who make some of the best beer in the country, subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Tune in next week for another episode. Cheers.
Cheers.
This episode is brought to you by GEA. Around the world, every second liter of beer is brewed with the aid of systems and processes from GEA because their solutions address even the smallest details of the brewing process. GEA's range of services include everything from engineering, manufacturing, delivery, installation, automation, servicing, and more. At GEA, their goal is to help brewers make more beer of the highest quality in a cost-efficient and sustainable manner. To learn more, visit GEA.com and be sure to follow the GEA Craft Brewing page on Facebook. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.